Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, eclectic album reviews and gentle musical meanderings. I got another 6 album roundup for you guys. This is albums I've just been listening to for the past month or so. So superficial reviews, nothing too deep on these overview posts. But the idea here is to maybe hip you to something you maybe haven't heard before, maybe get you interested in going and checking out some of this music for yourself. So the first one I got up today is 88 Casio Junrei's Sig 88. A group that I discovered through a listener suggestion, and interesting sort of progressive psychedelic side to their sound, but they have all this sort of jagged angularity of, like, you know, almost a punk pop group. And again, across the board, all 3 of these players in this band are killer players, drummers full of energy, guitar players this kind of weird like Eddie Van Halen, Robert Fripp hybrid, and lead singer is this really charismatic person who really plays some bass. Overall, the band kind of has the playful nature of the Flaming Lips, but the intensity of Mars Volta. And if you're willing to overcome the language barrier to check these guys out, I think it's well worth doing. Okay, next up I got Astronoid's Radiant Bloom. With a band like Astronoid, whose concept really drives the music so hard, you could make the argument this is kind of more of the same. But when the concept is as good and as well developed, I think, as Astronoid's is, that's kind of a compliment. And although this album kind of doesn't quite recapture all of the energy of their debut album, I think it also kind of supersedes the work that they did on their previous album, the self-titled second album. And overall, I think Radiant Bloom really harnesses the energy of the band while still pushing their narrative forward. Okay, next up I got Slowdive's Everything is Alive. Slowdive is a very influential shoegaze band from the mid-90s who, after making a string of 3 or 4 pretty important albums to the genre, kind of broke up for a while. And just a few years ago, they got back together. So even though they've been around for a while, this is only their 5th album. And Everything Alive kind of surprised me initially because it had such a strong modular synthesizer component. And it turns out that this album started to kind of grow out of their when they got back together from some synthesizer experiments. Now, if you listen to it song by song, it still really presents itself overall as a sort of a dream pop album, classics in that style. For me, it relates a lot back to the music I was listening to in the early aughts, early teens, whenever I was living in Austin and listening to a lot of M83 and My Bloody Valentine and that sort of thing. And like a lot of music in this style, it's got all these ethereal and subtle layers going on that aren't really super obvious on the surface. You know, songwriting is not the biggest draw in a lot of this style of music. I mean, it's part of it, and songs are here. But really, the thing about it is the way all the sounds are layered on top of one another. I mean, challenge yourself. Listen to this album. Find one sound, one tone, and just watch it sort of disintegrate and reintegrate to another timbre as you go through the album. It's really fascinating to listen to it evolve and mutate from one tone into the next. And that's the thing I think it really is the draw on this album, just the overall vibe of it. Okay, next up I got Colin Hayes, Going Somewhere.
My, it's a beautiful world. I like swimming in the sea. I like to go out beyond the wide breakers, where a man can still be free, or a woman if you are one. I like swimming in the sea.
Now, I'm a big Men at Work fan, and I've always felt like Colin Hay never really got the chance kind of that he deserved. His material always felt like to me that he could have been on the level of a guy like Sting or Peter Gabriel, and for whatever reason has just never quite acquired the level of polish that those guys did to break into that realm. It reminds me a little bit of whenever Adrian Belew released his acoustic Adrian Belew album. A lot of really great songs in that album from a guy that you'd think was his normal thing is to play like this crazy electric stuff, but toned it down and showed his songwriting skills. That's what's on display here with Colin Hay. Amazing songwriting that's immediately accessible. And you can also see when listening to Going Somewhere how his songwriting existed within the framework that was Men at Work. And about how if you're a songwriter, especially in the songwriter in a band, how you have to subject your songwriting to the whims of the rest of the group. That's done less now, I think. But certainly in the 80s, that was the case. So listening to his songwriting style, stripped down bare, pretty much just anything but him and an acoustic guitar, is really informative to see the genius behind his songwriting and also how it was integrated into some of the songs that we know from Men at Work. Okay, next up I got Lisa Belladonna's Destinations. Incredible album from Moog, Acolyte, synth whiz Lisa Belladonna. Now, it's impossible to ignore the specter of Jean-Michel Jarre on this album. And that kind of tweaks my heartstrings a little bit. I love Jean-Michel Jarre, even though I think he's kind of hokey sometimes. Man, you can't deny the way in which he pushed the synthesizer forward. Lisa Belladonna, of course, has the benefit of hindsight. So not only is she kind of following in Jean-Michel Jarre's footsteps, but all of the years and decades of innovations that people have done with these keyboards, she has in her back pocket. But the big difference between her and Jarre is she's got chops. You know, Jean-Michel Jarre wasn't always the greatest keyboardist. He was more of a synthesist and a composer. Lisa Belladonna is all those things and can play the heck out of the synthesizers too. So if you're a fan of that kind of like, I hate to call it new age because that's not really a good label for that music, but you know, Jean-Michel Jarre, late 70s, Guitaro, that stuff, I think she's going to fire off some receptors in your brain. This is a pretty good example of what can happen in that style in a contemporary setting. And finally, I got Death Grips Government Plates.
Government plates on location. I'm a corporation. Provocation.
Now, I got fully committed to the Death Grips paradigm back in the day when the Money Store came out. That album really blew my mind with this sort of super aggressive sound. It kind of fired off receptors in my brain that I hadn't felt since, like, you know, Rage Against the Machine was a big on my playlist. And if you look at Death Grips' description, they are usually explained as being like a experimental hip hop group, or sometimes a noise hip hop group. And after the Money Store, they kind of started getting more into this experimental side, more into the noisy side. And I think that in some ways, Government Plates was kind of where that really started to hit ground zero. Their noisiest, most kind of confrontational work in some ways. Now, Government Plates came out at a time whenever I was very adamant about having physical copies of albums. And so it wasn't released on CD. Death Grips was kind of releasing a lot of music at a really fast pace, and I was kind of just trying to digest it all. I was still trying to get my mind wrapped around No Love, Deep Web. And then this kind of came out and sort of slipped under the cracks, and I sort of blew it off at the time. So it's cool to come back to it now, especially with fresh ears. I still think it's pretty noisy and confrontational work overall. I mean, from a certain perspective, MC Ride is just pretty much yelling obscenities for a good chunk of the album. But despite that, you really can't ignore the depth and complexity of all the electronic stuff that's going on, especially when you look at Zach Hill, drummer Zach Hill's sort of electroacoustic style. He's touted as the drummer on the album. He's a very skilled, percussionist. But if you're listening super carefully, he's playing a lot of electric drums physically. There's an organic nature to the drumming that he does in this album, even though it sounds very electronic. So overall, I'd say it's one of Death Grip's less accessible works. But there's still a depth to it and a complexity to it that make it interesting and really compelling to sink into and listen to from a more nuanced perspective. Okay, that's all I got for you guys this time around. So if you like the video, like and subscribe and share it out with your friends. I'm also going to follow me over on Spotify. I'm putting tracks up from all these albums. I've got a big 2023 playlist. By this point, it's hours long. So if you want to figure out what you should be listening to, it's right over there. And we're really headed headlong into our best of 2023 curated playlist. And if you're a person that wants to be involved in the viewer's choice version of that, please check out my Patreon below. Until see you next time, catch you on the flip side.